Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory and you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page. What we do here on Tuesday nights at 6:30 is we read old folklore and fairy tales with a little bit of sound effects and a lot of drama. And some silliness, of course, because folk tales, well, they didn't always take themselves very seriously. If you've never been here before, the structure is basically I'll read a few stories. Some will be quite short, and some might be a little longer and more developed. They're not really fairy tales. We do sometimes read fairy tales, but we tend to read folklore, and folklore is a little more varied. I will say there's nothing particularly shocking about the stories tonight, but just for future reference, it isn't specifically a children's type of stream. Folklore can be quite adult, but that's not tonight. And if you are new here and you're not watching this live, you can check in the description down below and you can click on any of the timestamps there. It'll take you to the beginning of a song or whatever else. But the theme tonight is sort of Irish ghosts is what I called it. I've done a bunch of stuff on ghosts. I did pretty much the entire month of January on ghosts. There's a lot of stuff about ghosts. This one in particular, though, is about sort of the inscrutable will of ghosts in folklore. And I'll go into that a little bit more, but remember, if at any point you're like, let's just get to the stories, you get down into the description and you click on the timestamps and it'll take you to the beginning of whatever story interests you the most. I see that we had some messages from before the stream start from a Wolf Munro, which is a fantastic name. It said, hey, just click through from Mastodon. Mastodon is great. That's if you were trying to find me and talk to me, that is the place to do it. I'm just messing around on my computer, so I'm going to leave this tab open in the background. Maybe I'll hear some ghost stories or something, but then they sent a message that they have company coming, so they'll listen later, and that is fine. Hello, later, Wolf Monroe. Hope you enjoy the stream, and if you don't, thank you for giving it a shot anyways. And GS is here and says, good evening, GS. So let's talk about ghosts, because I'm sure you don't want to hear me talk blabbity blab too much. You want me to get to the stories, but I do want to say a little bit about sort of where I'm coming from with the choices tonight. So this is basically about the kind of change in perspective you see in stories about ghosts. So that in a modern ghost tale, and by modern I mean in the last like 75 to 100 years. Sorry, my hair is being a little feathery today. What ghosts often are sort of the puzzle or mystery at the center of the story that a protagonist needs to figure out, and if they figure it out, they free them. In modern ghost stories, the actual motivations of the ghosts are often pretty explicit, I think anyways. In other words, it's not, she was, unjustly murdered or something, and that's the reason why she's here. Whatever, trapped in a house or whatever. But in folklore, it's a lot more random. So I want to sort of give a little bit of a blurb about why I think that is, and then we'll look at some examples of those stories where the motivations of the ghosts are very obscure and hard to understand. I should say, though, there are lots of folklore stories that are fairly explicit about why the spirit holds to the mortal realm, but tonight we're interested in the ones that aren't, because it's just as common as the rest. And so, while it is debatable, for me it's fairly obvious why there are these sort of unexplained ghost stories, and it's because a lot of the reason why modern ghost stories goes towards explanations, I think, this is the philosopher in me, is that the Enlightenment kind of had its impact on that kind of story. It made it hard to just accept something as opposed to have an explanation for it. And I'm not putting any judgment on that one way or another. I'm just saying that's a fact that the Enlightenment brought upon the idea that we explain things through reason and empiricism for the most part. Exactly what they classed as that was a little bit variable, but in general, that was the attitude. But that idea, well, it wasn't new when a lot of these folklores were collected, hadn't really spread into mostly illiterate farmers on a mountainside in this case Ireland, but probably also Germany. And illiterate here isn't an insult, it's just a fact. For most of history, most of humanity was illiterate. So a lot of the sort of ideas of the Enlightenment, the idea that you should be skeptical, the idea whatever, didn't really bleed into that culture. Instead, they had their own traditions of oral tales. And so what that means is that very more often in these tales, they're willing to accept that some things are just unknowable. The message of most of these stories, I think, is that the world has a layer of the uncanny to it. And because it isn't really a mortal realm, and it isn't really of anything that we do day to day, we can't make sense of it as mortals. We just need to accept that. And so the exceptions to who could sort of make sense of what to do about ghosts was priests, wise old ladies who would eventually become sort of witches and villainized, but there was a period of time, especially in those sort of pagan roots, where they were filling the role that priests would eventually fill in folklore. The wise old woman. Or old man, but in a lot of our stories you'll see more so woman. Anyways, they would bring up, the priest or the old woman would bring strange rituals that would free a ghost, and no one ever really understood why. And you can see that those trends about that kind of idea come along, can be seen as sort of a reflection of the reach of the church in that region, because, you know, the church, especially the Catholic Church at that time, would have told you that you conduct penance using rituals that save your unseen soul. So there's this uncanny layer. You don't need to necessarily understand it. You trust the priest that this ritual relates to your unseen soul. But you can also see it as lingering elements of paganism, where rituals were used to obtain results in the world, though the connection between those two things were very unclear, whether that was sacrificing animals for a better harvest or something more abstract. Or you could just see it as the human tendency to relate unrelated things and pass those superstitions on to further generations without much justification. Just sort of trust me, don't do this, do that, whatever, this will make the spirits happy. Whatever the case may be, the three stories that we're going to look at today are basically examples of inscrutable motivations of spirits. Some completely inscrutable. No idea. But the last story I included as an example of a more direct explanation where the ghost kind of explains themselves, but it's not clear why that would hold a soul in the mortal realm. And again, it's sort of just left as the uncanny and ununderstandable by mortals. So that's a long explanation, longer than usual. But what we're going to look at is some fun old ghost stories. These were all collected by Yeats. Yes, that Yeats, the one that writes the poetry, the Irish turn-of-the-century poet. Yeats, as I've mentioned many times on the show before, has a book called The Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, which was collected. And also I should add that Yeats was what I call a true believer. He believed in fairies, and he believed in their actual literal existence. And he saw himself as doing a bit of a taxonomic thing, trying to record the different types. So keep that in mind with the collection. The actual stories are collected from people that he names, but he's the editor. He's the one who writes it down and sort of navigates how to deliver the story he was told in print. And of course, I don't know if you know this, but Yeats is a bit of a good writer. So that's what we're doing tonight, the inscrutable will of ghosts. I'm under no delusions that this will be our most popular one, but who knows? I've been surprised before. Last week did very well. A lot of people seem to enjoy it, which is what I do it for. Okay, our first story tonight is going to be called The Black Lamb. And I think we need a little bit of a countryside and a little bit less fireplace. It's quite warm where I am, so you might appreciate the chilly wind sounds. Maybe even, what do you think? This is Ireland. A little bit of light rain makes sense, doesn't it? Our first story tonight is called The Black Lamb. It's a short story collected from Lady Wilde by W.B. Yeats in his collection, which you can view for free on Gutenberg.org, The Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. It is a custom amongst the people, when throwing away water at night, to cry out in a loud voice, "Take care of the water!" Or literally, from the Irish, which is, he means the language, which if you don't know, is its own distinct language. "Away with yourself from the water!" For they say that the spirits of the dead last buried are then wandering about, and it would be dangerous if the water fell upon them. Well, one dark night, a woman suddenly threw out a pail of boiling water without thinking of saying those warning words ever so important. Instantly, a cry was heard of a person in pain, but no one was seen. However, the next night, a black lamb entered the house, and it could be seen that its back had all the flesh scalded, and it lay down moaning by the hearth and died. Then they all knew that this was the spirit that had been scalded by the woman, and they carried the dead lamb out reverently and buried it deep in the earth. Yet every night, at the same hour, it walked again into the house. And lay down and moaned and died. And after this had happened many times, the priest was sent for, and finally, by the strength of his exorcism, the spirit of the dead was laid to rest. The black lamb appeared no more. Neither was the body of the dead lamb found in the grave when they searched for it, though it had been laid by their own hands deep in the earth, covered with clay. So, like, on the one hand, you can say, oh, look, it's about this spirit that got scalded, and that's, don't overthink it, Rory, that's the reason it haunts, and so on and so forth. And, obviously that's true, but why would hot water affect the undead? Is it a reference to sort of baptismal stuff, or is it something else more obscure from history? And why would it then haunt the series, the house? Hard to say. Inscrutable. GS says a lamb ghost. That's a first for me. I'll have to think about that. I don't know if that's the first time I've seen a lamb ghost. Anyways, our next story is a little bit longer. Not quite a bit longer. Our last story is probably the longest. And it is called The Radiant Boy. Now, this one's a bit of a different atmosphere, so let's get... Our next story is called The Radiant Boy, collected from Mrs. Crow by W.B. Yeats in his collection The Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. Captain Stewart. Afterwards, Lord Castlereagh. Remember that. When he was a young man, happened to be quartered in Ireland. He was fond of sport, and one day the pursuit of game carried him so far that he lost his way, and the weather, too, had become very rough. And in this strait he presented himself at the door of a gentleman's house. and sending in his card, requested shelter for the night. The hospitality of the Irish country gentry is proverbial. The master of the house received him warmly, said he feared that he could not make him so comfortable as he could have wished, his house being full of visitors already, added to which some strangers, who were also driven by the inclemency of the night, had sought shelter before him, but such accommodations as he could give he was heartily welcome to. Whereupon he called his butler, and committing the guest to his good offices, told him he must be put up somewhere, and do the best he could for him. There was no lady, the gentleman being a widower. Now Captain Stewart found the house to be a bit crammed, but a jolly party it was. His host invited him to stay and promised him good shooting if he would prolong his visit a few days, and in fine, he thought himself extremely fortunate to have fallen in such pleasant quarters. At length, after an agreeable evening, all retired to bed, and the butler conducted him to a large room, almost divested of furniture, but with a blazing turf fire in the grate, and a shakedown on the floor composed of cloaks and other heterogeneous materials. Nevertheless, to the tired limbs of Captain Stewart, who had had a hard day's shooting, it looked very inviting, but before he lay down, he thought it advisable to take off some of the fire, which was blazing up the chimney, in what he thought a bit of an alarming matter. Having done this, he stretched himself on the couch and soon fell asleep. Now, he believed he had slept about a couple of hours when he awoke suddenly. And was startled by such a vivid light in the room that he thought it on fire, but on turning to look over at the grate, he saw the fire was out. Though it was from the chimney that the light proceeded. He sat up in bed, trying to discover what it was, and was then he perceived the form of a beautiful naked boy. He was surrounded by a dazzling radiance. The boy looked at him earnestly, and then the vision faded, and all was dark. Now Captain Stewart, so far from supposing what he had seen to be of a spiritual nature, and no doubt that the host or the visitors had been trying to frighten him, accordingly he felt indignant at the liberty, and on the following morning, when he appeared at breakfast, he took care to evince his displeasure by the reserve of his demeanor, and by announcing his intention to depart immediately. The host expostulated, reminding him of his promise to stay and shoot. Captain Stewart coldly excused himself, and at length the gentleman, seeing something was wrong, took him aside, pressed for an explanation. Whereupon Captain Stewart, without entering into particulars, said he had been made the victim of a sort of practical joking, and that he thought it quite unwarrantable with a stranger. Now the gentleman considered this not impossible amongst the parcel of thoughtless young men that he had taken in, some of which he never knew, and appealed to them to make an apology, but one and all, on their honor, denied the impeachment. And it was then that suddenly a thought struck the host. He clapped his forehead with an uttered exclamation and rang the bell. "Hamilton," said he to the butler, "where did Captain Stewart sleep last night?" "Well, sir," replied the man, "you know every place was full and the gentlemen were lying on the floor, 3 or 4 in a room, so I gave him the boys' room. But I lit a blazing fire to keep him from coming out." "You were very wrong," said the host. You know I have positively forbidden you to put anyone there, and have taken the furniture out of the room to ensure it not be occupied." Then retiring with Captain Stewart, he informed him very gravely the nature of the phenomena, and at length, being pressed for further information, he confessed that there existed a tradition in the family that whoever the radiant boy appeared to will rise to the summit of power, and when he has reached that climax, will die a violent death. And I must say, he added, that the records that have been kept of his appearance go on to confirm this persuasion. Now, I don't know exactly who Lord Castlereagh was, but I suspect that's the punchline of the story, is that he did indeed do that. Once again, though, what is this spirit? Like, is it even a ghost? If it's a spirit, what does it do? Why is it there? Who knows? Who knows? I'm open to all the reasoning in the world in the comments as per usual. I see Felix is in the chat. Hello, Felix. Hope your day is going well. It's been a while since I've seen you. Felix has appeared on the show on Thursdays before. Is an excellent writer in his own right. You can read some of his writing on our website, which is varietal-literature.ca, but there's links down in the description below if you want to look at writing from myself or some of the other Vancouver authors. GS says, nice of the host to inform his guest of his wonderful demise. Yeah. I mean, would it be ruder not to, or is it like, it's done, so whatever? Okay. Well, our last story tonight is, I think, one of my favorite ones of the night. As I usually do, I'll end on the one I really like. It's sort of a little bit longer than the others, but I will say it is still a bit of a shorter one, and the reason for that is we actually have been taking care of a foster cat over the last couple of days, and it has been absorbing a lot of time, so I didn't have my usual buffer of time to pick and confirm permission to read stories and so on, so these are the ones I was able to get done in time. I'm sorry if you feel them a little short. I do apologize for that. Anyhow, this is our last story of the night. It's called Grace Connor. Let's go with that Irish countryside feel again. Our last story of this evening is Grace Connor, which is a story collected from Miss Letitia McClintock and was collected by W.B. Yeats, who edited together in his collection Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry. Taddy and Grace Connor lived in the borders of a large turf bog in the parish of Clondalkin, where they could hear the Atlantic surges thunder in upon the shore. And see the wild storms of winter sweep over the muckish mountain and his rugged neighbors. And even in summer, the cabin by the bog was dull and dreary enough. Thady O'Connor worked in the fields, and Grace made a livelihood as a peddler, carrying a basket of remnants of cloth, calico, drugget, frieze about the country. People rarely visited any large town. They found it convenient to buy from Grace, who was welcomed in many a lonely house where a table was hastily cleared that she might display her wares. So beloved was she and her wares. Now, being considered a very honest woman, she was frequently entrusted with commissions to the shops in Letterkenny and Ramelton. As she set out towards home, her basket was generally laden with little gifts for her children. "Grace, dear," would one of the kind housewives say, "here is a farrel of oaten cake with a taste of butter on it. Take it with you for the weans, children." Or, "Here's a half-dozen eggs. You've got a big family to support." Small Connors of all ages crowded round the weary mother when she returned home to rifle her basket of these little gifts. But her thrifty and hard life came suddenly to an end, as she died after an illness of only a few hours, and was waked, not woken, but like a funeral, and buried as handsomely as Taddy could afford. Now Taddy, her husband, was in bed the night after the funeral, and the fires, well, they still burned brightly. And when he saw his departed wife cross the room and bend over the cradle, terrified, he muttered rapid prayers and covered his face with a blanket, and on looking up again, the appearance was gone. Well, now, the next night he lifted the infant out of the cradle and laid it behind him in the bed, hoping thus to escape his ghostly visitor, but Grace was presently in the room and stretching over him to wrap up her child. Shrinking and shuddering, the poor man exclaimed, "Grace, woman, what is it brings you back? What is it you want with me?" "I want nothing for you, Taddy, but to put on the wean back in her cradle," replied the spectre in a tone of scorn. "You're too feared for me, but my sister Rose will not be feared for me. Tell her to meet me tomorrow evening in the old Wallsteads." Well, Rose lived with her mother. It was about a mile off, so she still obeyed her sister's summons, and she didn't have the least bit of fear, and instead kept that strange tryst in due time. "Rose, dear," she said, as she appeared before her sister in the old Wallsteads, "my mind's uneasy about them 2 red shawls in the basket. Mattie Hunter and Jane Taggart paid me for 'em, and I bought 'em with their money. Friday was 8 days past. Give 'em the shawls the morrow, and old Mosey McCorkle give me the price Wiley coat. It's in under all other things in the basket, and now farewell, I can get to my rest." Now, for those who have no idea what I just said, partially because of how I said it badly, she has explained that she owed some people some tapestries and blankets and stuff that she'd been paid for, but had not given them it. "Grace, Grace, bide a wee minute," cried her faithful sister as the dear voice grew fainter and the dear face began to fade. "Grace, darling, Taddy, the children, one word more." But neither cries nor tears could further detain the spirit hastening to its rest. So, that one is the one where we get an explanation. She basically had unfulfilled orders and felt guilty about that, and being a good business person was like, I'm not going to the grave having unpaid debts. But I think it's worth pointing out, like, what her sister points out in the end there, that apparently she doesn't want to talk to her family one last time, doesn't want to talk to her kids one last time. Instead, she wanted a balanced account book, and then she's out. Now, I should say, if you were like, well, those weren't particularly scary ghost stories, I should say I'm not targeting a particularly scary ghost story, and I don't think they're meant to be particularly scary. But if you do want to hear some more unnerving and scary ghost stories, on this channel, you can go to the Fireside Fairytales playlist. And on the Fireside Fairytales playlist, if you get back to October, we've done at least 2 years worth. That's where the genuinely, like, content warning, gory, scary tales are. Hands down, the most popular video I've ever made was one about the person who inspired Lovecraft's World. I think it's called Lovecraft Before Lovecraft. It's stories of the ocean. It is truly a person that inspired Lovecraft. It is a person he explicitly references a few times, with a lot less baggage than Lovecraft, I will say. So that might be a good jumping off point if you're looking for some straight horror or ghost stories. But for my money, in October, the first week of October last year, I read a story that was about, I forget what I titled it, but it was something about a different view of fairies. I don't know. The icon is a guy going in a door, and it's a story by a woman author, I believe, and I forget her name, but it is a story about a kind of different version of the fairies and how they contend with humans. That is, in my opinion, one of the most unsettling stories I've ever read. I highly recommend it. But if you are a horror junkie, go watch those. Obviously, I keep an eye on what's popular, and I can try to do more horror throughout the year. I always try to do it in October. But these were more sort of fireside fun versions. Gia says, she wanted to honor her obligations. How wonderful. Yeah, but she didn't care about her family, apparently. That's the part that's funny to me. I feel like there is always a bit of Irish wit in these tales, and it's always very subtle. And I feel like this is less a story about a particularly faithful businesswoman and more like a jab in the side of, what's the word I'm looking for here? Of somebody who was annoyed that their mother never gave them time because she was always busy, and that's what she worried about the most. I don't know. It's folklore. It could be a multi-source thing. Anyways, like I said, this is a bit of a shorter one, but that's because we have a little kitty that we're taking care of. And it's running around. I don't know if it's picked up on the camera, but it hasn't shut up. It's a very talkative kitty. It's anxious. It's trying to escape and things like that. And this is a weird thing to do, and cats get unnerved when things are weird. So I didn't want to do this too long when he just got here. But I'll make up the difference later. Though I should say, I'll confirm maybe on Thursday, but I may not be around next week. Don't freak out. It's just going to go see some family, so there may not be any shows next week. We'll see how my time works out. Beyond that, anybody who has given me a chance, anyone who has given me a chance, watch the videos. I hope you enjoy it. There's a lot of different styles of stories that we've told in that playlist. You can go back, find something that interests you. I'm sure you'll enjoy at least one or two of the stories. And if you did, please consider subscribing, or if you don't want to subscribe, but you did enjoy this video, I really appreciate it when people give a like. It definitely means the most when you're in the small niche corners of YouTube. A place, don't get me wrong, I enjoy game streaming and stuff like that, but a place that is primarily game streaming and like stunts that cost $1 million, it is a tough place to make a name with, old stories, but that's what I like, and I hope you did too. Well, GS, thanks for keeping me company, and Wolf, thank you for giving me a chance if you came back and watched this. Nonetheless, thank you very much for hearing the stories of some Irish ghosts that are hard to understand. I'll keep the fire warm for you. Have a good sleep.